the largest city on the planet, vanished. Not slowly, the way most civilizations fade. Completely. Within a single human lifetime, a capital of 120,000 people, defended by walls 20 kilometers around, powered by an aqueduct built from 2 million dressed limestone blocks, holding a library of 30,000 tablets that contained the oldest literature in human history, was reduced to an unmarked mound in the desert. 211 years later, a Greek army marched directly past its ruins and did not recognize them. Their commander wrote down the measurements of the walls, attributed the city to the wrong civilization, called it by the wrong name, and kept walking. The real name would not be spoken again for another 2,000 years. 71% of the settlements in the surrounding region emptied out and stayed empty for over a century. And for 180 years after the ruins were finally rediscovered, no historian, no archaeologist, no one could explain how this level of erasure was possible. Then, in November 2019, a geologist pulled a rock out of an Iraqi cave 30 kilometers from the ruins, and the rock told the whole story. Tonight, we are going to follow that story from a king who thought he had conquered water itself, through the drip-by-drip testimony of a 4,000-year-old stalagmite, to Ashurbanipal's burning library where destruction became preservation, to a Yale archaeologist who called what happened the mother of all catastrophes, and finally to a drying trend measured in the same cave, in the same minerals, heading in the same direction, in the same place, right now. And by the end, the question will not be whether this happened before. The question will be whether you are watching it happen again. So settle in, get comfortable, subscribe, or join if you have not already. And if you want to go deeper across physics, history, collapse, and the patterns that keep repeating, the Patreon is where those longer explorations live. Stay to the end on this one, because the last 15 minutes are where the data stops being ancient and starts being personal. Let's ease into it. In 401 BCE, a Greek mercenary named Xenophon was leading 10,000 starving soldiers through northern Mesopotamia. They had just survived a catastrophic defeat near Babylon. Their generals had been murdered during a fake peace negotiation, and now they were marching north along the Tigris, trying to reach the Black Sea before the Persian cavalry caught them and finished them off. They were exhausted. They were terrified. And on one particular day, after covering roughly 30 kilometers of flat, dusty terrain, they came to something strange. 2 enormous mounds rising from the plain, the remains of walls so massive that even in ruin they dwarfed anything Xenophon had seen in Greece. The foundation stones were polished limestone embedded with shells, 15 meters wide and 15 meters tall. On top of that sat a second wall of mud brick, another 30 meters high. The entire circuit ran for nearly 20 kilometers. Xenophon looked at it, wrote a few lines in his journal, called it Mespila, said it had once been inhabited by the Medes, noted a local legend that Zeus had sent a thunderstorm so terrifying the inhabitants surrendered. And then he kept walking. He had no idea what he was standing in front of. Nobody alive did. The 10,000 marched past the ruins, and Xenophon's account of the journey, the Anabasis, became one of the most widely read texts in the ancient world, studied by military commanders for centuries, translated into dozens of languages. And in all of that time, not a single reader realized that the great deserted stronghold he described was Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the largest city in the world, less than 211 years before Xenophon walked past it, a city of 120,000 people. with gardens that may have been the actual hanging gardens misattributed to Babylon, with an aqueduct system that predated Roman engineering by 4 centuries, with a library of over 30,000 cuneiform tablets that contained the oldest known version of the flood myth, the oldest surviving epic poem in human history, and the most comprehensive archive of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge ever assembled. All of it gone, not just destroyed, forgotten. The name itself erased from human memory so completely that a literate, educated Greek scholar could walk through its ruins 2 centuries later and not even know what civilization had built them. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think we move past facts like that too quickly. The largest city on the planet, the seat of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, became an anonymous pile of dirt in less than 10 generations. Shepherds grazed their flocks over it. Villages were built on top of it. The mound that contained the palace without rival, a structure with 80 rooms lined floor to ceiling with carved stone reliefs, with human-headed winged bulls weighing over 30 tons each, flanking its gates, with corridors so long you could walk for an hour without seeing daylight. That mound was known locally as Kuyunjik, just a hill. Nobody dug into it for over 2,400 years. And here is what should genuinely disturb you about this. Until November of 2019, nobody could fully explain how it happened. Not the destruction. Destruction is straightforward. Armies destroy cities. That part we understand. What nobody could explain was the totality, the complete and permanent erasure of what had been the most dominant political entity on the planet. Historians have been trying for 180 years, ever since a 28-year-old British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard started pulling winged bulls out of the ground in 1845. They proposed civil war. They proposed imperial overextension. They proposed military defeat. All of those things happened. None of them explained why the aftermath was so absolute, why no one rebuilt, why no one returned, why the land itself seemed to reject human habitation for over a century after the empire fell. Then, in November 2019, a team led by a geologist named Ashish Sinha at Cal State Dominguez Hills and an archaeologist named Harvey Weiss at Yale published a paper in Science Advances that changed the entire story. And the reason I have spent an unreasonable number of hours reading everything connected to this paper is something I need you to hold in the back of your mind for the next 2 hours. The same climate signal that destroyed the Assyrian Empire has been detected in the same region, in the same river systems, in the same agricultural zones, right now, today. And the response, then and now, is functionally identical. But before we can understand what that means, you need to see what was actually lost. Because the scale of what vanished beneath those mounds near Mosul is something you were never told in any history class. And the reason you were never told is that the Assyrian Empire does not fit neatly into the story Western education tells about the ancient world. It is too advanced, too brutal, too strange, and the manner of its death is too uncomfortable because it implies something about the relationship between civilization and climate that we would very much prefer not to be true. The story starts with a king who believed he could engineer his way out of nature, and it ends with the ground proving him wrong. Around 705 BCE, a man named Sennacherib inherited the throne of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He was roughly in his 30s. His father, Sargon II, had spent most of his reign building an entirely new capital city from scratch at a site called Dosharukin, modern-day Khorsabad, about 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh. It was a vanity project of staggering proportions, a city built to glorify one man, and Sargon never got to enjoy it. In 705, During a military campaign in Anatolia against the kingdom of Tabal, Sargon was killed in battle, and his body was never recovered. The army retreated without the king's corpse. In the ancient Near East, that was not just a military disaster. It was a cosmic verdict. A king whose body was lost on the battlefield had been abandoned by the gods. His works were cursed. His city was tainted. Sennacherib inherited a throne shadowed by that curse. He took one look at his father's city, at Dur-Sharrukin with its freshly carved reliefs and its pristine gates, and decided he would never set foot in it again. The city his father had spent decades building was effectively abandoned within a year of its completion. An entire royal capital, discarded like contaminated clothing. Instead, Sennacherib chose Nineveh. It was an old city sitting on the eastern bank of the Tigris, directly across from what is now Mosul, and it had been inhabited in some form for nearly 6,000 years. But Sennacherib did not want to refurbish an old city. He wanted to build something that would make his father's cursed capital look like a provincial outpost. He wanted to build something that would make every other human structure on Earth look primitive. He called it the Palace Without Rival. And based on everything archaeologists have found since Layard started digging, the name was not an exaggeration. It might have been an understatement. The palace compound covered roughly 5 hectares, at least 80 rooms. Their walls were lined with carved alabaster reliefs, panel after panel, depicting military campaigns, siege warfare, lion hunts, and religious ceremonies. Some of these carvings are still among the most technically accomplished stone reliefs ever produced by human hands. The lion hunt reliefs in particular, now in the British Museum, show a level of anatomical precision and emotional intensity that would not be matched in Western art for over 2,000 years. There is a famous panel showing a dying lioness, her spine severed by arrows, dragging her paralyzed hind legs behind her as she roars. It is simultaneously beautiful and devastating, and it was carved in approximately 645 BCE, more than 2 millennia before the Renaissance. The doorways of the palace were flanked by lamassu, colossal human-headed, winged bulls carved from single blocks of gypsum, weighing up to 30 tons. Their faces are serene, almost gentle, which is a disturbing contrast to the content of the reliefs they guarded. 5 of these lamassu stood at the entrance to the throne room, alone. They had 5 legs each, an optical trick that made them look like they were standing still when viewed from the front and walking when viewed from the side. Someone thought about that. Someone designed a 4-meter-tall stone creature with an intentional optical illusion built into its anatomy. In 700 BCE, and the palace existed within a military and administrative machine that operated at a scale the ancient world had never seen and would not see again until Rome. I need you to understand the Assyrian military, because it is the thing that makes the collapse incomprehensible without the 2019 paper. This was not a kingdom with an army. This was an army with a kingdom. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the first state in history to maintain a permanent, professional standing military. Before the Assyrians, armies were assembled from farmers and conscripts when war was necessary, and disbanded when it was over. Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE, created something new: a full-time, year-round, professional fighting force. Infantry, cavalry, chariot corps, siege engineers, intelligence units. These were not seasonal warriors. They were career soldiers, equipped with standardized iron weapons, trained in coordinated battlefield tactics, and supported by a logistics infrastructure that could project power across thousands of kilometers. The Assyrian army at its peak could field between 100 and 50,000 and 200,000 men. For context, the army Alexander the Great used to conquer the Persian Empire a few centuries later numbered roughly 47,000. The Assyrians routinely deployed forces 3 to 4 times that size. Their siege warfare was so advanced that they had purpose-built battering rams mounted on wheeled platforms, covered in wet leather to resist fire, with armored towers from which archers could suppress defenders on the walls. The reliefs from Sennacherib's palace show these machines in action during the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE, and the level of tactical sophistication depicted is remarkable. Coordinated approach, suppressive fire, escalade teams, undermining crews, all operating simultaneously. But here is what powered all of it. Grain. Every horse, every soldier, every engineer, every supply wagon, every garrison in every conquered province required a continuous supply of cereal agriculture, barley and wheat, grown in the rain-fed fields of the Assyrian heartland. The military machine was a conversion engine. It took agricultural surplus and transformed it into territorial control. Without the surplus, the machine starved. Without the machine, the territory fragmented. The entire system, from the Nile to the Iranian plateau, was a pyramid balanced on the tip of seasonal rainfall in northern Mesopotamia. And the deportation program made this dependency even more extreme. The Assyrians did not just conquer territories. They relocated entire populations. The deportation system was systematic, bureaucratic, and enormous. Over a period of roughly 3 centuries, Assyrian kings forcibly relocated an estimated 4 million people. Populations from Syria were resettled in Iran. Populations from Iran were resettled in Babylon. Israelites were deported to the east. Elamites were moved to the west. The purpose was strategic. Move people away from their homelands and they cannot rebel effectively. Replace them with foreigners who have no local power base, and they become dependent on the Assyrian state for everything. But this system, brutal as it was, required an enormous administrative apparatus: record keeping, food distribution, housing, road maintenance, garrison supply, and all of it ultimately depended on the grain harvest. A bad harvest meant the deportation infrastructure frayed. Resettled populations went hungry. Garrison supply lines thinned. The administrative web that held the empire together weakened at every node simultaneously. The drought did not need to cause a military defeat directly. It just needed to cut the caloric foundation that every other system was built on. And then the empire ate itself from the inside. Remember this. Remember the grain, because when we get to the 2019 paper, the grain is what makes the climate data so devastating. The Cuneiform record is not measuring abstract atmospheric conditions. It is measuring the variable that determined whether the largest military machine in the ancient world could feed itself. And the answer, starting around 675 BCE, was no. But the palace was not even the most remarkable thing Sennacherib built. The most remarkable thing was the water. Nineveh sits in what is technically rain-fed agricultural territory. That means its food production depends on seasonal rainfall, not on irrigation from rivers the way Babylon to the south depends on the Tigris and Euphrates. This is a critical distinction, and I am going to come back to it because it is the hinge on which the entire collapse turns. But for now, what matters is that Sennacherib understood correctly that a city of 100,000 people in rain-fed territory needed a guaranteed water supply that did not depend entirely on the weather. So he built one. Between 703 and 688 BCE, over a period of roughly 15 years, Sennacherib constructed an integrated canal, an aqueduct system spanning approximately 50 kilometers from the mountain springs north of the city to its gates. The system had multiple intake points, collecting water from different streams and wadis and channeling it south through a network of canals that converged on Nineveh. The centerpiece was the Aqueduct at Xenophon, which carried a canal across the Atrash River Valley on a stone bridge built from over 2 million dressed limestone blocks. The blocks were fitted together with waterproof cement. The joints were sealed. The gradient was carefully calculated to maintain steady flow without erosion. The construction techniques were so precise that when the aqueduct was first properly surveyed by Thorkild Jacobson and Seton Lloyd in 1933, the two archaeologists described the level of engineering as comparable to anything they had seen from the Roman period. I want to be very specific about that comparison because it matters. When people think of ancient aqueducts, they think of Rome, the Pont du Gard in southern France, the Aqua Appia. Those structures date to the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. The Xenophon aqueduct was functional by roughly 690 BCE. Sennacherib's engineers were solving hydraulic problems that Roman engineers would not encounter for another 4 centuries. And they were solving them with comparable sophistication. And then there are the screws. This is the detail that stopped me when I first encountered it. And I have to tell you the full story because the implications have never been properly appreciated outside of a very small circle of Assyriologists. In 2013, Stephanie Daly, an honorary research fellow at Somerville College, Oxford, and one of the most respected scholars of ancient Mesopotamian languages, published a book called The Mystery of the Hanging Garden of Babylon. Her argument, supported by extensive textual analysis and archaeological evidence, was that the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were never in Babylon at all. They were in Nineveh, built by Sennacherib. The gardens that the Greeks attributed to Nebuchadnezzar were actually the gardens of a different king in a different city. And the confusion arose because after Sennacherib conquered Babylon in 689 BCE, Nineveh was sometimes referred to in administrative texts as the New Babylon. Greek historians centuries later simply muddled the two. Daly found passages in Sennacherib's own inscriptions describing his palace gardens as a wonder for all peoples. She found references to terraced plantings, elevated gardens watered by an aqueduct. A bas-relief from Nineveh, now in the British Museum, depicts a palace with trees growing on terraces above arched structures, exactly the configuration described in Greek accounts of the Hanging Gardens. And she found a passage in Sennacherib's inscriptions that describes something extraordinary. The king writes that he had bronze helicoid mechanisms cast, devices that could lift water vertically from canal level to garden level. Large copper screws rotating inside tubes, raising water continuously. Bronze water-lifting screws, cast in a foundry in northern Iraq. In approximately 700 BCE, the device we call the Archimedes screw, named after the Greek mathematician Archimedes of Syracuse, who lived from roughly 287 to 212 BCE, may have been anticipated by Assyrian engineers roughly 4 centuries before Archimedes was born. Sennacherib's inscription specifically describes the casting process for these screws, the bronze alloy used, the challenge of the manufacture. Daly published a detailed analysis of the passage in collaboration with J.P. Oleson in the journal Technology and Culture in 2003. The Parthenon was more than 2 centuries in the future. Greek democracy did not exist yet, and an Assyrian king was mass-producing hydraulic lifting devices and bragging about the metallurgy. The point of telling you all this is not to be exhaustive. It is to calibrate, to set the baseline for understanding the scale of what disappeared. This was not a primitive society that got unlucky. This was a civilization operating at a level of engineering complexity that the rest of the known world would not reach for centuries. When it fell, what vanished was not just a political entity or a ruling family. What vanished was a technological and administrative capability that would not be replicated in that region for over 2,000 years. The Roman Empire is often described as a high point of ancient engineering. Sennacherib's Nineveh was doing comparable hydraulic work 400 years before the Roman Republic was founded. And it has gone so completely that it took Layard's excavation in the 1840s just to prove it had existed. I need to tell you about the library now, because the library is the detail that haunts this story in a way nothing else does. Not because of what it contained, although what it contained is extraordinary, but because of how it survived, and because the story of its rediscovery contains a moment so improbable that if you wrote it as fiction, nobody would believe you. Ashurbanipal was Sennacherib's grandson. He came to the throne in 668 BCE and ruled until roughly 631. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful human being alive during his lifetime. The empire he controlled stretched from Egypt in the west to the Persian Gulf and the Iranian plateau in the east, from Anatolia in the north to the Arabian desert in the south. He had crushed a rebellion led by his own brother Shamash-shum-ukin in Babylon. He had sacked the Elamite capital of Susa so thoroughly that the city would not recover for over a century. His military reliefs at Nineveh show him hunting lions from horseback, which was not recreation. It was ritual. The king killing lions was a symbolic demonstration that the cosmic order was being maintained. But Ashurbanipal was also something unusual among Assyrian kings. He was literate, genuinely, passionately literate. His own inscriptions state that he took care of the wisdom of Nabu, of all inscribed and clay tablets, of their mysteries and difficulties, which he solved. He could read both Akkadian and Sumerian cuneiform. Sumerian had been a dead language for over 1,000 years by Ashurbanipal's time. Reading it was roughly equivalent to a modern English speaker being fluent in Hittite. He did not just collect tablets, he understood them, he annotated them. He was a scholar on a throne that controlled the known world. And he was also, simultaneously, one of the most brutal rulers in human history. I need you to hold both of those facts at the same time, because the paradox is important. The same king who assembled the first organized library in human history, who preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh for future generations, who could solve mathematical problems and translate dead languages, also commissioned reliefs depicting the methodical humiliation and torture of defeated enemies. The reliefs from his north palace at Nineveh show captured kings led on leashes, prisoners with their lips pierced by hooks, mass deportations. The sack of Susa depicted panel by panel with an attention to detail that is simultaneously artistic mastery and bureaucratic sadism. He had the Elamite king's head hung from a tree in his garden and threw a banquet in its presence. The famous garden scene relief, now in the British Museum, shows Ashurbanipal reclining with his queen under a vine arbor, drinking wine. If you look carefully at the tree on the left edge of the relief, the head of the Elamite king Teuman is hanging from it. This matters because the Assyrian Empire does not allow you the comfort of simple sympathy. When Nahum celebrated the fall of Nineveh, he was celebrating the destruction of a regime that had deported the 10 tribes of Israel, razed the city of Lachish, subjected an entire region to centuries of systematic terror. The Assyrians were not philosopher kings. They were not enlightened builders whose loss should be mourned uncritically. They were brilliant, innovative, ruthlessly efficient, and profoundly cruel. And they were erased from the earth so thoroughly that their cruelty and their brilliance were both lost for 24 centuries. That is what makes the Assyrian collapse such an uncomfortable subject. You cannot mourn it simply. You cannot celebrate it simply. A civilization that contained both the royal library and the impaled prisoners, both the Jewan aqueduct and the deportation infrastructure, both the lion hunt reliefs, which are among the most humane depictions of animal suffering in ancient art, and the war reliefs, which are among the most clinical depictions of human suffering, was destroyed, not by its enemies and not by its sins, but by rainfall. The rain did not care whether the empire was just or unjust. The rain did not care about the library or the deportations. The rain stopped, and the empire, all of it, the scholarship and the savagery alike, went into the ground. And he decided to build the largest collection of written knowledge humanity had ever assembled. Scribes were dispatched across the empire with explicit instructions. The British Museum's Ashurbanipal Library Project quotes from surviving orders in which the king tells his agents to seek out and send him any tablets they find that are suitable for the palace. He was not collecting casually. He was systematically acquiring the intellectual output of every culture his empire controlled or had contact with. Mathematical tables from Babylon, astronomical observations from Uruk, medical texts, legal codes, omen compilations, religious hymns, and literature, the oldest literature in the world. The result was a collection of over 30,000 cuneiform clay tablets, held in multiple rooms across the palace complex at Nineveh. The British Museum describes it as the biggest and most wide-ranging collection of texts yet assembled in its day. The subjects cover everything from state correspondence and diplomatic treaties to incantation series for treating illness, from astronomical records of eclipses and planetary movements to lexical lists that served as dictionaries between Sumerian and Akkadian. This was not a private collection. It was an institution, the first systematically organized library in recorded history. And buried in that collection was a text that would, when rediscovered 2.5 millennia later, change how the modern world understood its own religious traditions. In 1849, Austin Henry Layard, the 28-year-old British adventurer I mentioned earlier, was excavating the mound of Kuyunjik across the river from Mosul. Layard was not trained as an archaeologist. The discipline barely existed. He was closer to what we would now call an adventurer antiquarian, funded partly by the British ambassador in Constantinople, Sir Stratford Canning, and partly by the British Museum, and motivated primarily by the desire to find monumental art objects that could be shipped back to London. His methods were crude by modern standards. He dug tunnels through the mound, following walls, looking for carved reliefs and colossal statuary. When he found the lamassu, the winged bulls, he insisted on transporting them intact rather than cutting them into sections, the way the French had done with similar statues from Khorsabad. He built rafts on the Tigris. One of them sank. Several lamassu now sit at the bottom of the river. Layard's assistant during these excavations was a man named Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyriologist from Mosul, one of the first native Iraqis to participate in the excavation of his own cultural heritage. Rassam would go on to make discoveries of his own that rivaled Layard's. Together, they unearthed the palace without rival, room by room. Layard published his findings in 1849 in a book called Nineveh and Its Remains, which became a bestseller in England. For the first time in modern history, the Western world had proof that the biblical city of Nineveh was real, that the empire described in the books of Kings and Chronicles and Nahum had actually existed, and that it was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. But the tablets took longer to understand. They were shipped to the British Museum in crates. Thousands of fragments mixed together, many of them broken, all of them covered in a script that scholars were still learning to read. It would take decades to sort and translate even a fraction of the collection. And it was during that long, painstaking process, in 1872, 23 years after Layard's first excavation, that a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith found something that shook Victorian England. Smith was not a university scholar. He was an engraver's apprentice who had become fascinated with cuneiform and taught himself to read it by spending his lunch breaks at the British Museum studying the Nineveh tablets. The museum eventually hired him as a restorer, and one day, while piecing together fragments of a broken tablet, he realized he was reading a flood narrative, not a biblical flood narrative, a Mesopotamian one, older than the Bible, older than the Torah, a story in which a man is warned by a god that the world will be destroyed by a great flood, builds a boat, loads it with animals, survives while the rest of humanity drowns, sends out birds to find dry land, and eventually makes a sacrifice of thanksgiving when the waters recede. Smith presented his translation to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on December 3rd, 1872. The audience included the Prime Minister, William Gladstone. The implications were seismic. Here was a flood story predating the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, preserved on a clay tablet that had been baked hard in the fire that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BCE. The tablet was part of a longer work, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we now recognize as the oldest known piece of epic literature in human history, dating in its earliest forms to roughly 2100 BCE. The Daily Telegraph offered Smith 1,000 guineas to go to Nineveh and find the missing portion of the flood tablet. He went. He found it. On his third expedition in 1876, he contracted dysentery in the field and died near Aleppo at the age of 36. He never completed his work. I am telling you the George Smith story, not because it is a digression, but because it condenses something essential about this entire subject. The most important literary discovery of the 19th century was found in tablets that only survived because the city that held them was burned to the ground. The destruction preserved the knowledge. The knowledge only reached us through an act of violence that erased the civilization that created it, and the man who unlocked that knowledge died in the same region where the civilization died, of the same kind of cause, which is to say, the land killed him too. Remember that. The land kills what it is done with. And I want to stay with Layard for a moment longer, because his experience at the excavation reveals something about the emotional shock of this discovery that the dry language of archaeology obscures. When Layard published Nineveh and its remains in 1849, it became a sensation. It outsold everything in England that year, except the Bible. And the reason it sold was not archaeological curiosity. It was religious validation mixed with existential vertigo. Here were the Assyrians of the Old Testament. Here were the winged bulls, the war chariots, the siege engines that had terrified the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Here was proof that the Bible's most terrifying villains were real, and that they had been vastly more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, and that they had been erased so completely that the location of their capital had been forgotten for 24 centuries. Layard himself described the experience of uncovering the palace in terms that read almost like trauma. Imagine yourself standing in the throne room of Sennacherib, he wrote, surrounded by carved panels showing entire armies on the march, rivers being crossed, cities being stormed, captives being led away in chains. Imagine the scale of it. Room after room, corridor after corridor, and all of it buried under 15 meters of earth, forgotten by every civilization that had lived above it for 2,500 years. The Western world had simply lost one of the most advanced civilizations in human history, not in a metaphorical sense, in a literal, physical, geographical sense. It was under the ground, and nobody knew. What Layard could not explain, and what would frustrate historians for the next 170 years, was why the burial had been so total. Conquered cities get rebuilt, abandoned cities get scavenged, ruins get quarried for building material. None of that happened at Nineveh. The mounds formed and stayed formed. The city was not repurposed. It was not recycled. It was sealed. And the only explanation that makes sense, the only one consistent with the archaeological evidence, is that the land around the city could no longer support a population large enough to justify habitation. The people left because there was nothing to eat, and they did not come back because the conditions that had made the city viable in the first place did not return for over a century. That brings us to the timeline of the collapse itself, and I need to walk through it year by year because the speed is part of what makes the 2019 paper so important. Without the climate data, the speed looks miraculous in the worst possible sense. With the climate data, it looks inevitable. Ashurbanipal dies around 631 BCE. This is the last moment of imperial coherence. After his death, the cuneiform record becomes sporadic and then stops. Business records from Nineveh dry up after 631. Royal inscriptions cease. The administrative machinery that had documented everything, every military campaign, every diplomatic exchange, every grain shipment, every deportation order, goes silent. That silence alone is a data point. Empires that are functioning produce records. The absence of records is evidence of dysfunction. A succession crisis erupts between Ashurbanipal's sons. Ashur-etil-ilani takes the throne briefly, probably around 631. His brother Sin-Shar-ishkun challenges him. There may have been a third claimant. The details are murky because, again, the records have stopped. What we know is that the internal fighting consumed military resources at exactly the moment the empire could least afford it. In 626, Nabopolassar seizes the Babylonian throne. His origins are debated. He may have been a Chaldean tribal leader. He may have been a Babylonian official who turned against his Assyrian overlords. What is not debated is that within 10 years, he had expelled every Assyrian garrison from Babylonia and was launching offensive raids deep into the Assyrian heartland. The raids would have been suicidal a generation earlier. The Assyrian army of Ashurbanipal's time would have destroyed Nabopolassar's forces in the field without difficulty. The fact that Nabopolassar could raid Assyrian territory with impunity tells you everything about how far the military had deteriorated. And the military had deteriorated because the grain had failed, and the grain had failed because the rain had stopped. In 614, Cyaxares of Media attacked from the east and captured the ancient city of Ashur, the spiritual capital of the empire, the city that gave Assyria its name. Nabopolassar arrived too late to participate in the siege, but signed a formal alliance with Cyaxares on the spot. The Babylonian Chronicle records that the two kings met at the ruins of Ashur and swore mutual loyalty. According to the later Babylonian historian Berossus, the alliance was sealed by a marriage between Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadnezzar and a Median princess. 2 years later, in the spring of 612, the combined Babylonian and Median armies marched north to Nineveh. The siege began in May. The city's walls were the same ones Xenophon would later describe. 12 kilometers of fortification punctuated by 15 monumental gates. Inside was a population weakened by years of agricultural failure and political chaos, but still defended by whatever remained of the imperial army. Outside were two relatively small forces from two states that, individually, the Assyrians had dominated for generations. The siege lasted 3 months. Some ancient sources suggest that the Kos River, which flowed through the city via a channel Sennacherib had engineered, flooded during the siege and damaged a section of the wall. If that is true, and there is archaeological evidence supporting it, then there is a grim irony at work. The water infrastructure Sennacherib built to sustain the city became the instrument of its destruction. The river he channeled through his capital breached the walls he built to defend it. Nahum, the Hebrew prophet, had written exactly this. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. Whether Nahum was prophesying or reporting intelligence, we cannot know, but the image is accurate. The city fell in August 612. King Sin-Sharishkan died in the fighting. Some accounts say he threw himself into the flames of his burning palace. The Babylonian Chronicle records that the city was turned into mounds and heaps. Archaeologists have found the remains of roughly 40 defenders in the destruction level, killed where they stood. A remnant force under a general named Ashurbanipal II retreated west to the city of Haran, held out with Egyptian military support for 3 more years, and was finally destroyed in 609 BCE. After 609, there is no Assyrian state. There is no government in exile, no successor kingdom, no cultural continuity of any kind. The Assyrian Empire did not fade. It did not transform into something smaller. It simply stopped existing. The administrative records end. The population dispersed. The cities were abandoned. Within 2 generations, the ruins were unrecognizable. Within 10, the name was forgotten. Now I need to tell you what the prophet said. Because the fall of Nineveh was not just recorded by the Babylonians who caused it. It was foretold by people who had been praying for it. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, writing in the years before the fall, produced an entire book of the Bible devoted to the coming destruction of Nineveh. The book of Nahum is a celebration of divine judgment against the Assyrians who had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. In 722 BCE, destroyed the city of Lachish in 701 BCE, and subjected the remaining Jewish kingdoms to centuries of tributary domination. Nahum was not mourning Nineveh. He was exulting in its impending death. His language is vivid. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. The imagery is hydraulic. The very water infrastructure that Sennacherib built, the canals and the river gates that fed the city, would become the mechanism of its undoing. There is a scholarly debate about whether the Kos River, which ran through the city, actually flooded during the siege and damaged the walls, giving the attackers an opening. Some ancient sources suggest this is exactly what happened. If so, Nahum was not just prophesying in metaphor. He was describing the specific mechanism by which the defenses would fail. And then there is Zephaniah, writing around the same period, who prophesied that Nineveh would become a desolation, parched like the wilderness, and that flocks shall lie down in the midst of her, a resting place for beasts, parched like the wilderness, flocks lying down in its midst. When Xenophon passed through in 401 BCE, the ruins were surrounded by grazing land. Shepherds and their animals had colonized the mounds. Zephaniah's prophecy was not figurative. It was literally true. The city that commanded an empire from Egypt to Iran became a pasture, and it stayed a pasture for over 2,000 years. There is something deeply unsettling about prophecy that turns out to be accurate not because of divine intervention, but because of climate science. Nahum and Zephaniah were announcing what they believed was God's judgment on a wicked city. But the mechanism of that judgment, the actual physical process that turned Nineveh into a desolation, was a 60-year mega-drought that drained the agricultural capacity of the Assyrian heartland and made the empire unable to defend itself. The prophets attributed the destruction to divine will. The 2019 paper attributes it to a shift in oxygen isotope ratios in rainfall patterns over northern Mesopotamia. The result is the same. The city became exactly what they said it would become: parched, empty, grazed by animals. I do not know what to do with that convergence between prophecy and paleoclimatology, and I am not going to pretend I do. But I think it belongs in this story because it tells you something about the completeness of the erasure, when even the religious imagination of your enemies can accurately predict the precise physical state your civilization will decay into. The destruction is total, in a way that ordinary military defeat cannot achieve. The Babylonians conquered the city. The climate erased the landscape, and the prophets described the aftermath before it happened. 3 entirely different systems, military, climatological, and theological, all pointed at the same outcome. And none of them explained why until November 13th, 2019. And now, the science. Because the science is where this stops being a history lesson and becomes a warning. But first, I need to explain why it took so long. Because the gap between Layard's excavation in 1845 and Sinha's paper in 2019 is 174 years. And for most of that time, the question of why the Assyrian collapse was so total remained one of the great, unsolved problems in ancient Near Eastern studies. Dozens of theories were proposed. All of them were incomplete. And the reason they were incomplete is revealing, because it tells you something about the limits of how historians think about civilizational failure. The dominant explanations fell into 3 categories, and I want to walk through each one, because the failure of each theory is itself a piece of the puzzle. The first was the internal collapse theory. Ashurbanipal died without a clear succession plan. His sons fought a civil war. The administrative apparatus fractured. Regional governors became independent warlords. This is all true. But civil wars and succession crises are practically universal in imperial history. The Roman Empire survived dozens of them. The Chinese dynasties cycled through them every few centuries and rebuilt. The Ottoman Empire endured fratricidal succession for its entire 600-year existence. Civil wars destroy governments. They do not typically erase civilizations from the physical landscape for a century. Something else was happening. The second was the overextension theory. The empire had stretched its military too thin. It controlled too much territory with too few resources. Garrisons were spread across a 1,000-kilometer frontier. When challenged simultaneously on multiple fronts, the military could not concentrate force effectively. Again, true, but empires that overextend typically contract to their core. They lose peripheral territories and consolidate around the heartland. That is what Rome did when it abandoned Britain and the Rhine frontier. That is what the Ottomans did across the 19th century. The Assyrians did not contract. They vaporized. The heartland itself was emptied. Not just the frontier, the core. The third was the military defeat theory. The Babylonians and Medes formed an alliance, besieged Nineveh, and destroyed it. This is the most straightforward explanation, and it is factually accurate. But it explains the event, not the aftermath. Cities fall in siege warfare and get rebuilt. They fall and get repopulated. They fall and become the capitals of the conquering power. Nineveh fell and became a desert for a century. Nobody rebuilt it. Nobody reoccupied it. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar built their own magnificent capital and showed no interest in restoring Nineveh. The Medes retreated to their own territory. The site was simply abandoned. And this is the puzzle that drove Harvey Weiss. Weiss, who had already made his reputation with groundbreaking work linking the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE to a major drought event, had long suspected that climate played a role in the Assyrian collapse as well. But suspecting it and proving it are different things. The problem was the absence of a high-resolution paleoclimate record from the Assyrian heartland itself. There were regional climate proxies from marine sediment cores in the Mediterranean, from speleothems in Turkey and Israel, from lake cores elsewhere in the Near East, but none of them provided the precision needed to match climate events to the specific timeline of Assyrian history with year-level or even decade-level accuracy. As Sinha's paper puts it directly, a lack of paleoclimate records from the region, with age control and temporal resolution comparable in precision to Assyrian historical and archaeological records, had precluded assessment of whether regional climate change contributed to the rise or collapse of the Assyrian Empire. That sentence is important. It is saying that the data to answer the question simply did not exist until Sinha's team created it. The mystery persisted for 174 years, not because historians were incurious, but because the physical evidence was locked inside a rock in a cave that nobody had sampled with the right instruments. Cuneiform Cave sits in the Zagros mountain foothills of Iraqi Kurdistan, at an elevation of roughly 660 meters above sea level. Its GPS coordinates are 35 degrees, 9 minutes, 32 seconds north, 45 degrees, 38 minutes, 47 seconds east, near the city of Suleymania, roughly 30 kilometers from the ruins of Nineveh. The cave is about 500 meters deep. The ambient temperature inside is a stable 18 degrees Celsius. The relative humidity is 95%. In November 2007, Ashish Sinha and his colleagues entered the cave and collected 2 stalagmites. One was about 12 centimeters long. The other was about 41 centimeters. They labeled them NIR 1 and NIR 2. What they were looking for was a paleoclimate proxy, a natural recording device that preserves information about past climate conditions in its physical structure. Stalagmites are almost ideal for this purpose. They grow from the ground up, layer by layer, as rainwater percolates through the cave ceiling, picks up dissolved minerals from the rock above, and drips onto the cave floor. Each layer of calcite that gets deposited records the chemical composition of the water that formed it, and the chemical composition of that water reflects the climate conditions at the time the rain originally fell. Specifically, what Sinha's team was measuring was the ratio of heavy to light oxygen isotopes in each layer. Oxygen comes in 2 stable forms that matter here. Oxygen 1,6, which has 8 protons and 8 neutrons, and oxygen 18, which has 8 protons and 10 neutrons. Oxygen 1,8 is heavier. In a region like northern Mesopotamia, where most rainfall comes from Mediterranean moisture transported by westerly winds, wetter periods tend to produce rainfall with a lower ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16, while drier periods produce a higher ratio. The relationship is not perfectly simple. There are complications involving temperature and moisture source, but the general principle is well established and has been validated by decades of paleoclimatology. So when you cut a stalagmite in half, polish the cross-section, and measure the oxygen isotope ratio layer by layer from bottom to top, You are reading a rainfall record from old to young, year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium. And because stalagmites also incorporate trace amounts of uranium, which decays into thorium at a known rate, you can use uranium-thorium dating to pin each layer to a specific calendar year with remarkable precision. The error bars on Sinhar's dates are typically plus or minus a few decades, which for a record spanning 4,000 years is extraordinary. Sinhar's team cut both stalagmites along their growth axes, polished the cross-sections, and used an automated triaxial micromill to extract subsamples for isotopic analysis. They measured dozens of uranium-thorium dates to establish the chronological framework, and then they compared the oxygen isotope record to the known historical timeline of the Assyrian Empire, using cuneiform records that Harvey Weiss, a professor of Near Eastern archaeology and environmental studies at Yale, had spent decades studying. The result is published as Figure 3 in the paper. I have stared at it for hours. It is one of the most chilling graphs I have ever seen in a scientific publication. And the reason it is chilling is not the complexity of the data, it is the simplicity. The graph shows two things overlaid on each other. The oxygen isotope record from Cuneiform cave, plotted over time, and the major events of Assyrian history, marked along the same timeline. And they match, not loosely, not approximately. They match the way a key matches a lock. From roughly 925 to 725 BCE, the oxygen isotope record shows the lowest values in the entire 4,000-year sequence. This is the wettest period in 4 millennia. Sinhar's team calls it the Assyrian megapluvial, and it corresponds almost exactly to the period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire's dramatic expansion. Ashurbanipal II, consolidating power. Shalmaneser III, extending the borders. Tiglath-Pileser III, reforming the army and creating the first professional standing military in history. Sargon II, building Dur-Sharrukin. Sennacherib engineering the water systems of Nineveh. All of it. All built during the wettest 2 centuries in 4,000 years of regional climate history. The empire was not built by military genius alone. It was built on rain. Anomalous, unprecedented, unrepeatable rain. The grain surpluses that funded the armies, the agricultural productivity that supported a population of over 1 million in the Assyrian heartland, the water table that made Sennacherib's canal system viable. All of it depended on a climate that had never existed before and would never exist again in the recorded history of the region. And then the rain stopped. I want to be careful with that phrase because the reality is worse than a sudden shut-off. What the Cuneiform record shows is not a switch being flipped, but a floor giving way beneath a civilization that did not know it was standing on a trapdoor. The oxygen isotope values shift upward starting around 675 BCE, but the transition unfolds over a decade, maybe 2, which means the Assyrians would have experienced it not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow, grinding deterioration. Each year, a little less rain. Each harvest, a little smaller. Each granary, a little less full. Each military campaign, a little harder to supply. Each garrison, a little more expensive to maintain. The frog in the pot. Except the frog is the most powerful military machine the ancient world has ever built. And the pot is the Fertile Crescent. Starting around 675 BCE, the oxygen isotope values in the Cuneiform record swing dramatically upward, the highest values in the entire 4,000-year record, the driest period in 4 millennia. Sinhar's team identifies a mega drought peaking between approximately 675 and 550 BCE, a 125-year dry period, with the most intense phase lasting roughly 60 years, coinciding almost perfectly with the political collapse of the empire. The 60-year figure is important. Think about what 60 years of drought means in human terms. It means that someone born at the start of the drought would never, in their entire natural lifetime, see a normal harvest. An entire generation would grow up not knowing what sufficient rainfall looked like. The institutional memory of abundance would die with the elderly. By the time the drought reached its deepest phase, no living person in the Assyrian heartland would have personal experience of the conditions under which the empire had been built. They would inherit the infrastructure of a wet civilization and try to operate it in a dry world. Every canal, every granary, every garrison, every administrative outpost was sized for a level of agricultural productivity that no longer existed and that nobody alive could remember. The grain harvest in northern Mesopotamia depends on a specific seasonal pattern. Winter rains between November and April provide the moisture that barley and wheat need to germinate and mature. In a normal year, meaning the year within the megapluvial that built the empire, the Assyrian heartland received precipitation above the 250 millimeter threshold for rain-fed cereal agriculture. Above that line, you get surplus grain. Below it, you get dust. The threshold is not a sliding scale. It is closer to a cliff. There is no half-harvest. There is harvest or there is failure. And the Cuneiform record shows that during the mega-drought, rainfall in the Assyrian heartland dropped below that threshold and stayed there for decades. The consequences cascaded through every system simultaneously. Without grain surplus, the standing army could not be maintained at full strength. Without the army, peripheral territories could not be controlled. Without tribute revenue from those territories, the central administration could not function. Without the administration, the deportation infrastructure that kept conquered populations in check broke down. Without population control, rebellions erupted everywhere at once. Each failure triggered the next. Each failure made the next one worse. And here is the statistic that, for me, makes the abstract horror of this tangible. Archaeological survey data cited in the Sinha paper shows that roughly 71% of all known settlement sites in the Kabul River Basin were abandoned during the collapse period and not reoccupied for over a century. 71%. Not of buildings, not of palaces, of towns, villages, farms, the places where ordinary people lived and grew food and raised children. 7 out of 10 simply emptied and stayed empty for 100 years. That is not what happens after a military defeat. That is what happens when the land stops supporting human life. The Babylonians did not depopulate the Kabul Basin. The drought did, and the depopulation was so complete and the land so thoroughly degraded that even after the drought eventually eased, the recovery took over a century. Xenophon in 401 BCE was walking through a landscape that 200 years after the collapse was still only partially recovered. The sheep grazing over the mounds of Nineveh were not a metaphor for decline. They were the literal economy of a region that had been ecologically devastated and was still rebuilding its carrying capacity 2 centuries later. I want to be precise about the timeline, because the precision is what makes this terrifying. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, dies around 631 BCE. The mega-drought, according to the Cuneiform record, is already well underway. Grain harvests in northern Mesopotamia are failing. The empire, which depends on rain-fed cereal agriculture, is slowly starving. Cuneiform texts from this period, which Weiss cross-referenced with the climate data, show that the Assyrians stopped launching long-distance military campaigns. They started building irrigation canals in the heartland, trying to imitate the irrigation-fed agriculture of Babylon to the south. But the canals were too small and the terrain was wrong. They were engineers, yes, but they could not engineer their way out of a drought that lasted longer than any human lifetime. Weiss found something in the Cuneiform record that I think deserves more attention than it has received. In the final decades of the empire, the administrative texts shift in character. The confident, expansionist tone of Ashurbanipal's inscriptions gives way to something that reads, even through the formal language of cuneiform bureaucracy, as anxiety. Texts show the Assyrians worrying about their alliances with distant provinces, fearing internal intrigue, communicating nervously with regional governors whose loyalty was uncertain. The machinery of empire was running on fumes. The correspondence has the quality of a system manager watching dashboard indicators turn red, one by one, writing increasingly urgent messages to subordinates who are not responding. Weiss described the synchronization between the climate data and the textual record as a historical pattern that is not only structured through time and space, but a time and space that is filled with environmental change. And he added a line that I think is the most important single sentence in any of the coverage of this paper. These societies experienced climatic changes that were of such magnitude they could not simply adapt to them. Read that again. They could not simply adapt. The most advanced civilization of its era, with the best engineers, the most sophisticated administrative system, the most powerful military, tried to adapt to a climate shift and failed, not because they were incompetent, because the shift was too large, too fast, and too sustained for any adaptation strategy to compensate. There is an archaeological detail from the emergency canal building period that makes the desperation tangible. The canals the Assyrians built in their final decades were qualitatively different from Sennacherib's monumental works. They were smaller, cruder, built quickly, without the precision engineering that characterized the Drought Aqueduct. They look like what they were, which is panicked improvisations by a state that suddenly realized its entire agricultural base was disappearing and tried to do in a decade what should have been done over a century. The terrain of northern Mesopotamia is fundamentally unsuited to irrigation agriculture on the Babylonian model. The topography is too irregular. The soil drains differently. The water table sits at the wrong depth. The Assyrians knew how to build canals. They were the best canal builders in the world, but they could not force a landscape to behave like a different landscape. They could not make the hills of the upper Tigris Valley function like the flat alluvial plain of Babylon, and they ran out of time trying. The Babylonians, meanwhile, were fine. And this is the part that should disturb you, because it reveals the mechanism that killed the empire with surgical precision. Babylon sits to the south in the alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Its agriculture is irrigation-fed. It does not depend on seasonal rainfall. When the megadrought hit, northern Mesopotamia dried out, but the rivers, fed by snowmelt and springs further upstream, continued to flow. Babylonian grain production was not affected. Babylonian state revenues were not affected. Babylonian military capacity was not affected. As Harvey Weiss explained in the Yale press release accompanying the paper, now we have a historical and environmental dynamic between north and south, and between rain-fed agriculture and irrigation-fed agriculture, through which we can understand the historical process of how the Babylonians were able to defeat the Assyrians. The Babylonians did not suddenly become better soldiers. The Assyrians did not suddenly become worse ones. The drought restructured the power balance of the entire region by selectively destroying the agricultural base of one state while leaving the other untouched. Think about what that means. Two empires, separated by a few hundred kilometers, one built on rain and one built on rivers. The same climate event strengthens one and destroys the other. It is not a story about military strategy or political wisdom or cultural resilience. It is a story about the location of the 250mm isoyet, the line on a map above which rain-fed agriculture is viable and below which it is not. That line moved south during the mega drought. And when it moved south, it moved past Nineveh. And when it moved past Nineveh, the empire died. The precision of this is what makes it feel almost deliberate, as if the climate chose a side, as if the land itself decided it was finished with the Assyrians and methodically withdrew the single condition that had made their civilization possible. Weiss called it the mother of all catastrophes, not just because of the scale of destruction, but because of the totality of the aftermath. The Assyrian heartland was not just conquered, it was depopulated. Archaeological survey data cited in the Sinha paper shows that roughly 71% of all known sites in the Kabul River Basin, which was the breadbasket of the empire, were abandoned during the collapse and not reoccupied for over a century. I want to pause here and make sure the significance of the 2019 paper is clear, because I think it has been undersold by virtually everyone who has covered it. The Yale press release uses the phrase for the first time to describe what Sinha's team achieved. For the first time, researchers were able to determine the underlying cause for the collapse. That is not marketing language. It is a precise claim about the state of knowledge in the field. Before the Cuneiform record, no one had a paleoclimate dataset from within the Assyrian heartland itself with sufficient temporal resolution to test whether climate change contributed to the collapse. There were theories. There were suspicions. Harvey Weiss himself had been arguing for decades that climate played a role based on his earlier work linking the fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE to a drought event. But arguing and proving are different things in science, and what Sinha's team provided was proof. A physical record, a rock that you can hold in your hands that grew layer by layer over 4,000 years, that recorded in the ratio of its oxygen atoms whether the rain fell or did not fall in each decade of that long span. And what the rock says is unambiguous. The wettest period in 4,000 years corresponds to the empire's rise. The driest period in 4,000 years corresponds to the empire's fall. The transition happens over a single generation. The correlation between the climate record and the historical record is tighter than virtually any other paleoclimate archaeology comparison in the literature. I have read a lot of paleoclimate studies. I have read studies linking drought to the Maya collapse, to the fall of the Akkadian Empire, to the decline of the ancestral Puebloan culture in the American Southwest, to the collapse of Angkor. In almost all of those cases, the climate data is either from a distant proxy site or has relatively coarse temporal resolution, or matches the historical timeline only approximately. The Cuneiform record is different. It comes from a cave 30 kilometers from Nineveh. Its temporal resolution is subdecadal, and it matches the Assyrian chronology with a precision that, frankly, I was not prepared for when I first saw Figure 3. That precision is what transforms this from an interesting archaeological finding into something that should be in every climate policy discussion, because it means we have a case study, a complete, detailed, precisely dated case study of what happens when a civilization dependent on rain-fed agriculture in the Fertile Crescent encounters a multi-decadal drought. We know what happens to the grain. We know what happens to the military. We know what happens to the administrative system. We know what happens to the population. We know how long the depopulation lasts. We know everything. And the case study is not from some obscure corner of prehistory. It is from the most powerful, most advanced, most thoroughly documented civilization of the ancient world. And it happened in the same place where the same type of agriculture is practiced today. There is a concept in engineering called a stress test, where you take a system and subject it to extreme conditions to see where it fails. The Cuneiform record is a stress test of rain-fed civilization in the Fertile Crescent, run by nature over 4 millennia, with the result documented in stone. The system failed catastrophically. The failure mode is known. The conditions that triggered the failure are known, and the conditions are recurring. 71%, not of the buildings, not of the palaces, of the towns, the farms, the villages, the places where people lived and grew food and raised children. 7 out of 10 simply emptied and stayed empty for 100 years. That is not what happens after a military defeat. That is what happens after the land stops supporting human life. And that is what Xenophon walked through in 401 BCE. Not just the ruins of a conquered city, the ruins of an abandoned landscape, a region so thoroughly hollowed out by decades of drought and the chaos that followed that even 200 years later, it had not fully recovered. The sheep grazing over the mounds of Nineveh were not a metaphor. They were the literal economy of a depopulated wasteland. But there is a layer to this that the paper does not dwell on, and that Weiss mentions only in passing. And that, I think, is the most important part of the entire story. And it is the reason I am telling you all of this. The 2019 paper does not just look backward, it looks forward. And what it sees forward should make you angry. Sinya is a professor of Earth and Climate Sciences at Cal State Dominguez Hills. His co-author, Gayatri Katayat, is a professor at Xi'an Jiaotong University in China. Together, they wrote a companion essay for the conversation, published alongside the Science Advances paper, and in it, they drew a comparison that the academic paper handles more carefully, but that the essay states directly. The modern Middle East is experiencing the same climate signal that preceded the Assyrian collapse, a multi-decade drying trend accelerating since the early 20th century, affecting the same river systems, the same agricultural zones, the same populations. In 2015, a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Colin Kelly, Shahzad Motadi, Mark Kane, Richard Seeger, and Yochanan Kushnir at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, analyzed the 2007 to 2010 drought in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent, the most severe drought in the instrumental record of the region. Their paper concluded that anthropogenic climate change made a drought of that severity 2 to 3 times more likely than natural variability alone could account for, and they described its consequences: widespread crop failure, loss of livestock, mass migration of farming families from rural areas to urban centers in Syria. Between 2006 and 2009, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Syrian farmers and herders lost their livelihoods. Many of them moved to cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Drought. The cities were already struggling with an influx of refugees from the Iraq War. The resulting social pressure contributed to the unrest that preceded the Syrian civil war. I want to be careful here because the relationship between the 2007 to 2010 drought and the Syrian civil war is genuinely complicated, and political scientists like Jan Selby have challenged the simplicity of the causal chain. The drought did not cause the war. Wars have political causes, but the drought amplified every pre-existing pressure, destroyed the economic foundation of rural communities across the region, and forced hundreds of thousands of people into urban areas that could not absorb them. If you wanted to design a scenario to destabilize a fragile state, you would start with the exact sequence that actually occurred. And the details on the ground become devastating when you know the Assyrian parallel. The 2007 to 2010 drought hit northeastern Syria hardest. This is the Jazeera region, the Syrian portion of Upper Mesopotamia. It is rain-fed agricultural land, wheat and barley, the same crops the Assyrians grew in the same soil 3,000 years earlier, the same dependency on the same seasonal rainfall pattern. In the winter of 2007 to 2008, the rains did not come. Wheat production in Hasaka province collapsed by over 60%. Farmers who had grown wheat for generations watched their fields turn to dust. Livestock herds were slaughtered or sold at distressed prices because there was no grain to feed them and no pasture to graze them on. Wells that had never run dry went empty. And the people moved. That is the part that maps onto the Assyrian data so precisely it is hard to think about clearly. They moved from the rural northeast to the cities, to Damascus, where the population had already swollen with refugees from the Iraq War, to Aleppo, where informal settlements expanded faster than the city could provide services, to Dara, where overcrowding and unemployment and resentment created exactly the conditions that precede civil unrest. The protests that began in Dara in March 2011 are generally considered the start of the Syrian civil war. They began in a city that had absorbed a wave of climate refugees from the drought-stricken northeast, in a country whose agricultural system had been hollowed out by 3 years of the most severe drought in its recorded history, in a region where the Cuneiform stalagmite shows that this kind of drought has happened before, lasted longer, and ended a civilization. And here is the connection that keeps me reading the same paragraphs of the Sinha paper at 2 a.m. The drought that destabilized Syria between 2007 and 2010 occurred in the same geographic region, affecting the same river systems, disrupting the same rain-fed agricultural zones, that the 7th century BCE megadrought devastated when it killed the Assyrian Empire. The Kharba Basin, where 71% of Assyrian sites were abandoned, is in modern northeastern Syria. It was one of the areas hardest hit by the 2007 to 2010 drought. Farmers in the Kharba Basin in 2008 were living through a climate event that, while shorter, was structurally identical to the one their landscape experienced 2,600 years earlier. Sinha told Nature Middle East, in an interview published alongside the paper, that our research suggests that these modern droughts offer a glimpse of what Assyrians endured during the mid-7th century BCE. He added that much of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean region is already in the grips of a century-long drying trend, and that this trend is not good news for a politically volatile and water-stressed region. Not good news. I have thought about that phrase a lot. It is the kind of understatement that scientists use when the implication is too large to state directly in a press interview. Not good news. The same climate signal that erased the most advanced civilization of the ancient world from the physical landscape of the planet is reappearing in the same region. And the scientist who identified it describes this as not good news. Let me spell out what Sinha's understatement actually contains. The Cuneiform record shows that the Assyrian megapluvial, the wet period that built the empire, was the most extreme positive rainfall anomaly in 4,000 years. The Assyrians treated it as normal because it was all they had ever known. When it ended, they had no reference point for what normal actually looked like. They had built their entire civilization, their agriculture, their military, their administrative apparatus, their population, for conditions that had never existed before. and would never exist again. Now consider the modern situation. The populations of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran, the countries that occupy the territory of the former Assyrian Empire and its immediate neighbors, total roughly 230 million people. Their agricultural systems, their water infrastructure, their economic models, their political structures are all calibrated to the climate conditions of the 20th century. And the 20th century, in the context of the Cuneiform record, is not a stable baseline. It is a point on a trajectory that is heading toward drier conditions. The IPCC, in its assessments of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, has documented a clear drying trend over the past century, with projections for continued and accelerating aridity through the 21st century. Climate models consistently show the region as one of the most climate vulnerable on the planet. Temperature increases of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which are well within the range of current emissions trajectories, would push large portions of Iraq and Syria below the viability threshold for rain-fed agriculture, below the ISO yet. And here is the connection that makes the Assyrian case study so relevant it should be in every policy briefing on regional security in the Middle East. The 2019 paper does not just establish that climate change contributed to the Assyrian collapse. It provides a calibrated measurement of the rainfall threshold below which complex civilization in this specific landscape fails. The Cuneiform record quantifies the drought intensity that corresponds to a 71% abandonment rate in the Kabul Basin. We know the number. We know the isotopic signature. We can compare it directly to modern measurements from the same region. We can ask, with scientific precision, how close modern conditions are to the threshold that destroyed Assyria. And the answer, according to Sinha's team, is that recent droughts in the region have already reached comparable intensity, just not comparable duration. The 2007 to 2010 drought was as severe as the 7th century megadrought in its peak intensity. It was just shorter, 3 years instead of 60. The question then is not whether a drought of Assyrian magnitude could happen in the modern fertile Crescent. The question is whether a drought of Assyrian duration could happen. And given the combined effects of anthropogenic climate change, upstream dam construction, groundwater depletion, and population growth, the answer from the climate science community is that the probability is increasing and the preparation is not. Not good news. That is the kind of understatement that should make you want to throw something. The data has been sitting there since 2019. It was published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. It was covered by Yale, by EOS, by The Conversation, by Nature, and it has produced effectively zero public discourse about what it actually means. Because what it actually means is that the climate conditions which erased the most powerful empire of the ancient world from the physical landscape of the planet are currently reassembling themselves in the same region. And the civilizations living in that region today are making the same structural mistake the Assyrians made. They are building on rain. There is a phrase in the companion essay that Sinha and Cathayat wrote that I need you to hear. Unsustainable growth in politically volatile and water-stressed regions is a time-tested recipe for disaster. That sentence is doing more work than it appears to. It is not just saying that the modern Middle East is at risk. It is saying that the Assyrian collapse is not an isolated historical event. It is a demonstrated pattern, a pattern with a known mechanism, a known trigger, and a known outcome. And the trigger is pulling again. I want to go back to the cave now, because there is a detail in the methodology that I think has been underappreciated, and that changes how you should think about the entire paper. When Sinha's team collected the stalagmites from Cuneiform in November 2007, The larger one, NIR2, was actively growing. Fresh calcite was being deposited on its tip at the time of collection. That means the climate record in that stalagmite extends all the way to the present. It does not just show you what happened 3,000 years ago. It shows you the trajectory from then to now in a single continuous record. And what the record shows is that the modern period, the 20th and 21st centuries, falls within a drying trend that is not yet as severe as the 7th century mega drought, but is moving in the same direction. The Cuneiform record does not predict the future. It does not need to. What it does is provide context. It shows you what 4,000 years of rainfall variability in northern Mesopotamia actually looks like. And it shows you that the wet period the Assyrians built their empire on was the exception, not the rule. The normal state of the region, across the full 4,000-year record, is drier than the conditions that made Assyria possible. And the current conditions are trending toward drier still. This is the part where I have to be honest about my own reaction, because I think intellectual honesty matters more than performance. When I first read the Sinha paper, I expected a straightforward paleoclimate study with an interesting archaeological application. What I found was something that reads like a warning that nobody seems to be hearing. The paper is meticulous. The methodology is rigorous. The correlation between the climate record and the historical record is tighter than I have seen in almost any paleoclimate study I have read. And the implications extend so far beyond ancient history that the fact it has been treated primarily as an archaeological curiosity makes me genuinely angry. Because the lesson of the Assyrian collapse is not that drought kills empires. That is too simple. The lesson is more specific and more dangerous. The lesson is that civilizations can be built on climate anomalies, and that when the anomaly ends, the civilization does not gradually adjust, it shatters. The Assyrians had the best engineers in the world. They had water infrastructure that would not be equaled for 4 centuries. They built canals and aqueducts and artificial wetlands, and none of it was enough, because the problem was not engineering. The problem was that the baseline had shifted. The rain that made their world possible was not normal. It was a spike. And when the spike ended, every system they had built, every canal, every granary, every military garrison, every administrative outpost, all of it was sized for a world that no longer existed. And I think about Sennacherib when I read this. I think about a king standing in his garden in 700 BCE, watching water flow through bronze helicoid screws that would not be reinvented for another 400 years, looking out over a city of 100,000 people fed by an 80-kilometer canal system that represented the most advanced hydraulic engineering on the planet. And I think about the fact that 70 years later, his grandson's empire would be ash and his city would be a mound in the desert. Not because the engineering failed, but because the rain stopped. The engineering was perfect for the world that built it. The problem was that the world changed. There is an archaeological detail from the final years that I think deserves more attention than it gets. Weiss, in his analysis of the cuneiform texts from the late Assyrian period, found evidence that in the last decades of the empire, the Assyrians began building irrigation canals in the heartland. Small ones, nothing like Sennacherib's grand aqueducts. Desperate, improvised attempts to switch from rain-fed to irrigation-fed agriculture. The same system that the Babylonians used to the south. But the terrain of northern Mesopotamia is different from the alluvial plain of Babylon. The topography is wrong. The water table is wrong. The soil composition is wrong. The canals were too small, and the infrastructure required to make irrigation work at scale in that landscape was beyond what could be built in a generation. They saw what was coming. They tried to adapt, and the adaptation failed because you cannot retrofit a civilization's agricultural infrastructure in the middle of a catastrophe. The time to build irrigation systems is during the wet years, when you have surplus labor and surplus political stability. By the time the drought was severe enough to make the need obvious, the resources to respond were already gone. That is the pattern, that is the lesson, and that is what makes the modern parallel so frightening. The time to adapt is not when the crisis arrives. The time to adapt is before. And in the modern Fertile Crescent, the crisis has been arriving for a century, and the adaptation has not even begun at the scale required. Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran, one of the largest saltwater lakes in the world, has lost roughly 90% of its surface area since the 1990s. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are carrying significantly less water than their 20th century averages. Turkey's dam-building program upstream has reduced flow to Iraq and Syria. Groundwater tables across the region are declining. The agricultural zone of the Khabur Basin, the same zone that was abandoned during the Assyrian collapse, is under severe water stress right now. And Mosul, the modern city that sits directly on top of the western bank of ancient Nineveh, whose municipal boundaries literally include the mounds of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus, is located inside one of the world's fastest drying river basins. I want to go back to the mounds one more time. There is something about the physical relationship between Mosul and Nineveh that I find almost unbearably poignant, and that I think condenses the entire meaning of this story into a single image. Nebi Yunus, the smaller of the two mounds that contain the remains of Nineveh, is named after the prophet Jonah. A mosque and shrine dedicated to Jonah sat on top of the mound for centuries. Beneath the mosque, invisible and inaccessible, lay unexcavated portions of the palace of Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's son. In July 2014, fighters from the Islamic State captured Mosul and a few weeks later detonated explosives that destroyed the Mosque of Nebi Yunus. They recorded themselves smashing Assyrian artifacts with sledgehammers. They bulldozed the Mashki Gate, one of the ancient city's 15 massive entrance gates. They recorded it all on video. But here is the thing that archaeologists discovered in the aftermath. When Iraqi and international teams went in to assess the damage after ISIS was expelled from Mosul in 2017, they found that the destruction of the mosque had exposed previously unknown portions of the palace of Esarhaddon, tunnels that ISIS fighters had dug beneath the shrine, looking for artifacts to sell on the black market, had accidentally broken through into chambers that had not been seen by human eyes since 612 BCE. Inside, they found carved reliefs still in place, inscriptions still legible. The destruction once again had exposed what was hidden. The fire that destroyed Nineveh preserved the library. The explosion that destroyed the mosque revealed the palace. This city has a relationship with its own destruction that I do not fully know how to articulate, except to say that it keeps giving us information about itself in exchange for being damaged, as if the ruins have a perverse kind of agency, as if the only way Nineveh can communicate with the future is through the violence done to it. I do not know what to do with that observation. I am telling you it because it is true, and because it unsettles me, and because I think the unsettlement is appropriate. Let me come back to the science, because the science is where this story becomes personal to you. The Sinha paper ends with a section that academic papers typically call the implications, or the broader significance, and in this case the broader significance is stated with a clarity that I think deserves to be heard by more than the few thousand people who have read the paper. The Cuneiform Speleothem record, they write, places the modern hydroclimatic trends in the broader context of the region's hydroclimate variability during the past 4,000 years. That sentence is doing something very precise. It is saying that we now have a baseline. For the first time, we can see where modern conditions fall relative to the full range of what this region has experienced over 4 millennia. And where they fall is on a trajectory that, if it continues, leads toward conditions we already know are incompatible with complex civilization in this landscape. The Assyrians did not have this information. They could not know that the wet period they were living through was anomalous. They had no 4,000-year record to compare against. They experienced a 2-century window of abundance and assumed it was normal. They built accordingly, and when normal returned, meaning the drier conditions that had characterized most of the preceding 2,000 years, everything they had built failed. We do have this information. The Cuneiform record exists. The Kelly paper on the 2007 to 2010 drought exists. The IPCC reports documenting accelerating aridity in the eastern Mediterranean exist. The satellite data showing Lake Ermia's collapse exists. The Tigris and Euphrates flow data exists. We are not in the position of the Assyrians. We are in a worse position because we know what happened to them. We know the mechanism. We know the trigger, and we can see the same trigger operating in real time. And we are building on the same land, in the same way, dependent on the same water, with the same assumption that current conditions will continue. Sinha told reporters in 2019 that we have the benefit of hindsight and plenty of observational data. He left the rest of the sentence unspoken. The rest of the sentence is the question of whether having the data will make any difference. I want to end where we started, with Xenophon. There is a moment in Book 3, Chapter 4 of the Anabasis that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I started researching this. Xenophon describes arriving at the ruins of Mespila and noting the foundation stones, the shell-embedded limestone, the sheer scale of the walls. He records the local legend that the city fell when Zeus sent a thunderstorm so terrifying that the inhabitants surrendered. And then he moves on. He moves on. He is standing in the ruins of the greatest city his species has ever built to that date, and he has no idea. He records the dimensions of the walls with the same detached precision he uses for every other stop on the march. He notes the name the locals gave it, Mespila, a name that bears no relationship to Nineveh, and that scholars have never been able to satisfactorily explain. He attributes the city to the Medes, who controlled it for about 50 years after the Assyrians fell, and who were already gone by the time he arrived. Every factual claim in his description is wrong except the physical measurements. He gets the walls right. He gets everything else wrong, and nobody corrected the record for over 2,000 years until Layard started digging in 1845 and pulled the winged bulls out of the earth. 2,446 years between the fall of Nineveh and its rediscovery. That is how long a civilization can stay buried. That is how completely a drought can erase a world. And there is one more thing, one more fact that I think you need to carry with you when this is over. When Sennacherib built his aqueduct system between 703 and 688 BCE, he had an inscription carved into the limestone blocks at Jerwan. Parts of that inscription have been recovered and translated, and in one passage, he describes what he has done for his city. He writes that he directed a watercourse to the environs of Nineveh over a great distance. He describes the gardens he planted, the exotic trees he collected, the fruits of all lands he set out for his subjects. He describes transforming Nineveh into what scholars have translated as a garden of almost paradisiac fertility, paradise. He thought he was building paradise, an engineered garden watered by bronze screws and limestone aqueducts, stocked with plants from every conquered province, maintained by the most advanced hydraulic infrastructure on the planet. And he was right. For one human lifetime, Nineveh was paradise. The gardens were real, the water was flowing, the grain was growing, the library was being assembled, the reliefs were being carved. The empire stretched from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. And then the Isayet moved. The 250-millimeter rainfall line slid south. The grain failed. The canals ran dry. The armies shrank. The vassal states rebelled. The Babylonians crossed the border. The Medes came from the east. The siege lasted 3 months. The palace burned. The tablets baked. The city fell. The mounds formed. The name was forgotten. The sheep grazed. Nahum's prophecy came true. Zephaniah's prophecy came true. Xenophon walked past. Layard dug in. Smith found the flood tablet and died in the field. Isis blew up the gate and accidentally exposed the palace. And Sinhar crawled into a cave 30 kilometers away and pulled out a rock that explained everything. I keep coming back to Sennacherib's inscription because I think it is the single most important artifact in this entire story, and not because of what it says about Assyria, because of what it says about us. A king stands in a garden of his own creation. Bronze screws lift water from canal to terrace. Exotic plants from every province of the empire bloom around him. An aqueduct built from 2 million limestone blocks delivers water from the mountains to his doorstep. He has engineers who can solve problems that will not be independently solved again for 400 years. He has over 30,000 clay tablets of accumulated human knowledge being catalogued in the rooms of his palace. He has an army that can project power across 3,000 kilometers of territory. He has more food, more water, more military capacity, and more knowledge than any human being who has ever lived. And he has 27 years of reign left. He does not know this. He cannot know it. The information is there, encoded in the mineral layers of a stalagmite growing slowly in the dark of a cave 30 kilometers from his palace. But no technology available to him can read it. The warning is written in the earth, and the earth has not yet learned to speak in a language humans can hear. It will take 27 centuries before someone invents the instrument that can translate. 27 years. That is how much time remained between the completion of the Jawan Aqueduct and the beginning of the mega-drought. 1 generation. If Sennacherib had a son born in the year the aqueduct was finished, that son would have lived just long enough to see the harvests begin to fail. He would have inherited the most sophisticated water infrastructure on the planet and watched it become insufficient. He would have stood in the garden of almost paradisiac fertility and watched the trees begin to die. There is a lesson in that image, and it is not the one you expect. The lesson is not that we should have better data. We already do. The lesson is not that we should build better infrastructure. The Assyrians had the best in the world, and it was not enough. The lesson is that engineering is not adaptation. Engineering is the optimization of a system for the conditions that exist when the system is designed. When the conditions change, the engineering fails, not because it was poorly done, but because it was done for the wrong world. Sennacherib optimized for a world with rain. We are optimizing for a world with a stable climate. The Cuneiform stalagmite says the rain was temporary. The IPCC says the stability is temporary. The question is what we do with the warning. And the answer, so far, is remarkably similar to what the Assyrians did in their final decades, which is build small, panicked, underfunded adaptations to a problem that is already larger than the adaptations can address, while the underlying trajectory continues unabated. And 26 centuries later, a geologist crawled into a cave 30 kilometers away and pulled out a rock that told the whole story. 200 years of rain that was never supposed to last. 60 years of drought that erased everything built on that rain. And a modern drying trend in the same place, measured by the same methods, heading in the same direction. The Assyrians had the best engineers in the ancient world, and they could not build their way out of a changed climate. We have better engineers. We have satellite data and computer models, and 4,000 years of paleoclimate records written in stone. We have everything the Assyrians did not have. The only question is whether we will do what they did, which is exactly what the data says we are doing, which is build on conditions we assume are permanent, expand on surplus we assume is guaranteed, and plan for a future that looks like yesterday. I want to be more specific about the modern situation because I think the abstract phrasing of climate risk reports obscures what is actually happening on the ground. The ground is the same ground. That is the point that keeps getting lost. Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran was within living memory one of the largest saltwater lakes on the planet. It covered roughly 5,000 square kilometers. Brine shrimp thrived in it. Flamingos nested on its shores. It was a UNESCO biosphere reserve. Today it has lost approximately 90% of its surface area. The lake bed is exposed salt flat. Windstorms carry toxic salt dust across surrounding farmland. The agricultural communities around the lake are collapsing. People are leaving. The mechanism is familiar. The water goes, the agriculture fails, the people move to cities. The cities cannot absorb them. The Tigris and Euphrates, the twin arteries that defined Mesopotamia and gave the region its Greek name, the land between the rivers, are both declining. Turkey's southeastern Anatolia project, known as GAP, is one of the largest infrastructure programs in the Middle East, involving 22 dams and 19 power plants on the headwaters of both rivers. The Ataturk Dam alone, completed in 1990, significantly reduced water flow to Syria and Iraq. When Turkey filled the dam's reservoir in 1990, it stopped the Euphrates entirely for a month. Syria and Iraq received nothing. This is not ancient history. This is 36 years ago. Iraq's water crisis is severe and worsening. The marshlands of southern Iraq, the same marshes that Sennacherib imported plants and animals from to stock his artificial wetland in Nineveh, have shrunk dramatically. Some estimates suggest they have lost over 90% of their original extent, though restoration efforts have partially reversed this in some areas. The agricultural productivity of the Tigris and Euphrates basin is declining. Salt accumulation in irrigated soils, a problem that has plagued Mesopotamian agriculture since the Sumerians, is worsening as water volumes decrease and salinity concentrations rise. And then there is Mosul itself. I have not been able to stop thinking about Mosul since I started this project, because the relationship between the modern city and the ancient ruins it sits on is not metaphorical. It is physical, literal. The eastern boundary of modern Mosul includes the mounds of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus. The city has expanded over the decades until its streets and houses press directly against the archaeological site. Layard's excavation trenches are walking distance from residential neighborhoods. The Tigris flows between the modern city center on the west bank and the ancient mounds on the east bank. They share the same water, the same air, the same declining rainfall pattern. In 2014, Mosul was captured by ISIS in a military offensive that stunned the world. The Iraqi army, a force of roughly 30,000, collapsed in the face of an estimated 1,500 fighters. The city, Iraq's second largest with a population of roughly 1.5 million people, fell in less than a week. The parallels to the fall of Nineveh are not exact, but they rhyme in ways that should make you uncomfortable. A major urban center in the same location, on the same river, fall into a force that was, on paper, vastly outnumbered, an institutional collapse so rapid that it defied every conventional military analysis, an aftermath involving massive displacement, destruction of cultural heritage, and long-term destabilization of the surrounding region. After capturing Mosul, ISIS fighters entered the Mosul Museum and recorded themselves smashing Assyrian artifacts with sledgehammers. They bulldozed the Mashki Gate at Nineveh. They detonated explosives that destroyed the Mosque of Nabi Yunus, the shrine to the prophet Jonah that sat atop the mound containing the unexcavated palace of Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's son. But here is the part that still haunts me. After ISIS was expelled from Mosul in 2017, Iraqi archaeologists and international teams went in to assess the damage. They found that the tunnels ISIS had dug beneath the Nabi Yunus shrine, looking for artifacts to sell on the black market, had accidentally broken through into chambers of Esarhaddon's palace that had not been seen by human eyes since 612 BCE. Inside, carved reliefs were still in place. Cuneiform inscriptions were still legible. The violence had exposed what 2.5 millennia of burial had hidden. The fire in 612 BCE preserved the library. The explosion in 2014 CE revealed the palace. Nineveh has a relationship with its own destruction that feels less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Every act of violence done to this city gives something back, as if the ruins have a perverse kind of agency, as if the only way Nineveh can communicate with the future is through the damage done to it. I do not know what to make of that. I am not making a supernatural claim. I am making an observation about a pattern that recurs across 26 centuries, and that I do not have a framework to explain. But I think it belongs in this story because it captures something about Nineveh that the dry language of archaeology misses. This city is not dead, it is buried, and it keeps speaking through its wounds. And now I want to ask you to consider the full picture. Not just the climate data, not just the historical narrative, but the geometry of the situation. Mosul sits on top of Nineveh. The modern city is literally built over the ruins of the ancient one. The people living in Mosul today walk on streets that run above the buried corridors of the palace without rival. Their water comes from the same Tigris that Sennacherib channeled through his city. Their agriculture depends on the same rainfall patterns that the Cuneiform stalagmite has been recording for 4,000 years. And that rainfall is declining. The Cuneiform record does not predict the future. It is a record of the past, but it establishes something that no other data source in the region provides, which is deep context. It tells you what the full range of rainfall variability looks like across 4 millennia. It tells you that the wet period the Assyrians built on was the anomaly, not the norm. And it tells you that the current trajectory is heading back toward the dry end of that range. Sinha and Cathayat wrote that we have the benefit of hindsight and plenty of observational data. That sentence is generous. It is also, I think, an accusation disguised as an observation. The benefit of hindsight. We know what happened the last time this region dried out. We know exactly what happened, year by year, city by city, field by field. The Cuneiform record and the Cuneiform archive together provide one of the most detailed case studies of climate-driven civilizational collapse in the entire archaeological record. And we are watching the same variables move in the same direction, in the same place, with the same agricultural dependencies. And we are doing exactly what the Assyrians did in their final decades, which is building emergency infrastructure that is too small, too late, and designed for a crisis that has already outpaced the response. Sennacherib's inscription at Jerwan is still partially legible. 2,700 years of weather have not completely erased it. You can still read the words of a king who believed he had solved the problem of water forever, carved into the stones of an aqueduct that has not carried water for 26 centuries. In a landscape that has not supported the population it was built to feed since the rain stopped falling in the 7th century before the Common Era. I want to go back to Xenophon one last time. Not to the famous passage about Mespila, but to something about the experience of walking through a dead landscape that I think captures the emotional core of this entire story. Xenophon's account of the march through this region is oddly quiet. He notes the walls, he notes the stones, he records the local legend about Zeus and the thunderstorm, and then nothing. He expresses no wonder, no awe, no meditation on the fall of empires. He treats Mespila the way you would treat a large rock formation by the side of a highway. Interesting. Noted. Moving on. And this absence of reaction is, I think, the most devastating detail in the entire Anabasis, because it means the erasure was so total that there was nothing left to react to. No visible grandeur, no readable inscriptions, no surviving population to tell the story. Just mounds and walls and silence and sheep. The 10,000 marched through what had been the most urbanized, most productive, most administratively sophisticated landscape on the planet, and they saw a desert dotted with ruins they could not identify. They were educated men, many of them. Xenophon himself was a student of Socrates. He could quote Homer. He knew Greek history going back centuries, but he knew nothing about the civilization that had built the walls he was walking past, because that civilization had been erased from human knowledge so completely that not even its name survived in the oral traditions of the people still living in the vicinity. The locals called the mounds Mespila. Nobody knows where that word comes from. It bears no relationship to Nineveh. The real name was gone. Try to imagine what that last generation experienced. The generation that watched the granaries empty and the garrisons thin and the vassal states break away, one by one, like tiles falling off a mosaic. Imagine inheriting the palace without rival, with its 80 rooms of carved stone, its corridors lined with depictions of an empire at its peak, and knowing that the farms which fed the artisans who carved those stones have failed. Imagine watching your children grow up in a world where the canals are running low and the rains are not coming, and the priests are performing the rituals and the rituals are not working, and the Babylonians are massing on the southern border, and the Medes are moving from the east, and nobody is coming to help because the road network that connected the empire has been abandoned because there is no grain to feed the garrisons that protected the roads. The Assyrians saw it coming. The cuneiform records from the final decades prove this. They tried to adapt. They built irrigation canals. They restructured their military deployments. They negotiated desperately with allied states. They performed rituals and consulted diviners and appealed to their gods. And none of it worked, not because they were foolish, not because they were decadent, not because they lacked intelligence or engineering skill or political acumen, because the problem was physical. The rain had stopped, and no amount of human ingenuity could make it start again. That is what keeps me up at night. Not that civilizations fall, that has always been true. Every school child learns about fallen empires. But the Assyrian collapse teaches something more specific and more dangerous than the general lesson that empires are mortal. It teaches that a civilization can be built on a variable it has mistaken for a constant. The Assyrians treated rainfall as a background condition of their landscape, as fixed and reliable as the Tigris or the Zagros Mountains. They built on it the way you build on bedrock, and it turned out to be weather. We do the same thing. We treat current climate conditions as the baseline against which all planning is done. We build cities, agricultural systems, water, infrastructure, economic models all calibrated to conditions we assume will persist because they have persisted within living memory. The Assyrians made the same assumption. For them, living memory covered 2 centuries of anomalous rainfall. For us, living memory covers roughly a century of conditions that we are now actively destabilizing through the emissions of fossil carbon. The timescales are different. The logic is identical. The inscription survives. The water does not. The city does not. The empire does not. The name, for 2,400 years, did not. And beneath Mosul tonight, the mounds of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus sit in the dark, holding the remains of 80 rooms and 30,000 tablets and winged bulls too heavy to move, while the Tigris runs lower than its 20th century average, and the rain-fed farmland to the north produces less grain each decade, and the Kuna Bar stalagmite, the one that was still growing when Sinha's team collected it in 2007, sits in a laboratory somewhere with its mineral layers recording a message that has been translated and published and peer-reviewed and presented at conferences and written about in accessible language for general audiences, and then, apparently, filed away and forgotten like a cuneiform tablet nobody can read, in a library nobody visits, in a palace buried under a city that does not remember it is there. The ISO yet is moving.